Everything around her seemed normal, but one morning, she never returned. No calls, no messages, just an eerie silence and a flood of questions. What could have happened in those few hours? Who was the last person to see her? Her disappearance would set the stage for a chilling and complex story, one filled with secrets, lies, and suspicion. It was a mystery that left those who knew her shaken and led them down a path darker than anyone could have anticipated. In April 2021, a significant turning point came in the life of Asal Aya. For years, she had dreamed of a better life, one filled with opportunities that would allow her and her family to live more comfortably. Then, out of nowhere, an offer arrived that seemed like a beacon of hope. It came from Murat Myrov, her cousin's husband. Murat, whom Asal had known for years, had been working in Georgia selling cars. He reached out urgently, saying he needed an assistant and that the work would be simple. He promised to help with paperwork and assist in handling vehicle transactions for clients from Kazakhstan. For Asal, this offer seemed like the answer to her prayers. Murat assured her that her role would involve organizing documents for clients, arranging meetings, and overseeing vehicle sales. He explained that the car market in Georgia was thriving, especially for used cars, and that there was high demand from Kazakh clients seeking more affordable vehicles. He also reassured her that his team was friendly and welcoming, and that they would help her settle in comfortably. The offer seemed almost too good to be true. A salary of $500 a month, free housing, and a flexible work schedule. Everything seemed perfect. Asal had never had such a promising opportunity, and for the first time, it felt like her dreams might finally be within reach. The idea of working abroad filled her with excitement, offering the chance for financial independence and a better future. She imagined saving up for her own apartment, supporting her parents, and ensuring they would be comfortable in their later years. These thoughts gave her strength and made her believe that this was the right decision. Asal had grown up in the small village of Kabin-Badi, located in Kazakhstan's Akmola region. Surrounded by vast, endless steppes, life in the village was simple, and the options available to her seemed limited. Most of her classmates either settled into village life by marrying young or found jobs in the local agricultural industry. For Asal, however, there was always a desire for something more. She dreamed of life beyond the village, a life full of opportunity, independence, and a chance to achieve something greater. After finishing high school, Asal moved to the capital city, Nur-Sultan, hoping to find her place in the world. There, she landed a job as a receptionist at a fitness center and moved in with her older sister, who offered her support during the difficult transition. The steady income from the receptionist job helped, but the pay was modest, and her dream of owning an apartment felt as distant as ever. She saved every bit of spare change, cutting back on little things in order to set money aside, always holding on to the vision of one day having a place of her own. A place where she could finally live on her own terms. Asal's dream was not just about securing a better life for herself, but also about giving back to her family. Her parents had worked tirelessly to raise her, ensuring she had everything she needed, and Asal wanted to repay them by providing for them in their later years. She wanted to help them live more comfortably and relieve them of the financial burden they had carried for so long. But, as time passed, it became clear that the opportunities in Kazakhstan were limited. Murat Myrov, her cousin's husband, offered her a position in Georgia. He was a businessman with a solid reputation, and he spoke confidently about the opportunities he could provide. He explained that he needed an assistant to help with paperwork and client relations for his car sales business in Georgia, catering to customers from Kazakhstan seeking more affordable vehicles. At first, Asal hesitated. She knew the decision would change her life, so she took time to think it through carefully. She had many conversations with her older sister, who was worried about Asal going to a foreign country, far from home, surrounded by strangers. But Murat was persistent, reassuring them that Georgia was a safe place and that he would personally look after her. He emphasized that this could be the stepping stone she needed to build a better future. Despite her sister's concerns, Asal felt that the opportunity might be the break she had been waiting for. She couldn't ignore the feeling that this was her chance to escape her limitations and change her life. The thought of breaking free from her routine and taking control of her future was too compelling. After much thought and weighing the risks, she decided to accept the offer. Her family, although unable to provide much financial help, supported her emotionally. They shared in her hopes and dreams, even though they too lived modestly. Asal flew to Georgia with a mix of excitement and uncertainty. The move felt like the beginning of something important, a new chapter filled with potential. Upon arrival, she moved into an apartment in Rustavi, which Murat had arranged for her. The apartment was small and furnished with older items, but Murat reassured her that it was only temporary, just a place to stay until she found something better. At first, Asal kept in regular contact with her family. She shared her experiences, talking about her new life with enthusiasm. She described the city, its old streets, and unique architecture, and excitedly told them about the local cuisine she was trying. Even the small things, like evening walks through Rustavi, delighted her. Her voice sounded happy, and she seemed confident in her decision. However, after a few weeks, things began to change. Asal's calls became less frequent, and when they did happen, her conversations were shorter and more guarded. There was a noticeable weariness in her voice, and sometimes a hint of unease. When her mother asked if everything was all right, Assel would usually blame work for her exhaustion, assuring her that everything was fine. But her words were less convincing, and her mother began to feel uneasy. Assel's mother tried to reach her more often, but many calls went unanswered. Each conversation felt more strained, and the joy that had once been evident in Assel's voice seemed to fade. The family grew more concerned, unsure of what was really happening. Then, one day, Assel's mother managed to get through to her via video call. When the screen finally showed her daughter's face, her mother's heart sank. The background was unfamiliar. A disorganized, cluttered room that didn't look like the apartment she had described. The furniture appeared to be hastily rearranged, and belongings were scattered about as though someone had either left in a hurry or didn't care about keeping things in order. Alarmed, her mother asked what was going on. Assel seemed hesitant, avoiding direct answers. She quickly dismissed her mother's concerns, but the situation seemed to grow more alarming by the day. The familiar warmth and optimism in her voice were gone, replaced by vague explanations and a clear sense of discomfort. Assel's mother could sense that something was wrong, but her daughter insisted that everything was fine. Despite her reassurances, it was becoming harder to ignore the signs of distress in Assel's voice. The once hopeful messages from Assel now seemed to mask something darker beneath the surface. She was no longer the bright and excited young woman who had left home full of hope and anticipation. Instead, the person her family was speaking to sounded tired, anxious, and increasingly distant. The situation was becoming more difficult for her family to ignore, and they were left with more questions than answers. On the morning of May 6th, a passerby in the Dei Diomi district of Tbilisi made a chilling discovery. Beneath a high-rise building, a lifeless body of a young woman lay on the ground. She was dressed only in a t-shirt, and for a time, no one knew her identity. Soon, however, investigators identified her as Assel Aya. The tragic details of her final moments began to emerge when a voice message sent to her best friend became crucial evidence in the case. In the hours leading up to her death, multiple attempts were made to reach Assel, but none were successful. Late on May 5th, her friend received the voice message. The recording was disturbing. A man's voice, filled with anger, could be heard accusing Assel of using him for her own gain. The man, who identified himself as Bezo, threatened Assel and blamed her for betraying him. His tone was harsh, and his words were menacing. Assel's friend, upon hearing the message, felt a deep sense of dread. It was clear that Assel was in danger, and the situation was spiraling out of control. In the same message, Assel's voice was filled with fear. She explained that Bezo had become physically aggressive, leaving her terrified. She spoke of feeling trapped with nowhere to go, unable to escape the situation. The friend immediately tried to reach Assel by phone, but the calls went unanswered. The fear for her safety intensified, and her friend realized that Assel was in real danger. Meanwhile, suspicion began to fall on Murat Myrov, Assel's cousin's husband, who had brought her to Georgia under the promise of work. Investigators would later uncover the grim truth about Murat's role in Assel's ordeal. He had exploited her vulnerable situation, subjecting her to severe mistreatment. He had taken advantage of the fact that she was alone in a foreign country, with no support system. After manipulating her trust, Murat handed Assel over to a man named Bezo, either in exchange for a car or some other promised payment. He was a 57-year-old Georgian with a criminal history. He had previously served a 10-year sentence for car theft and was known for his violent behavior. By the time the authorities identified him as a suspect, Bezo had already fled Tbilisi and was heading towards the border in an attempt to escape capture. However, the police acted swiftly, and within a day, he was apprehended. Meanwhile, Murat Myrov, who had initially lured Assel to Georgia with promises of work, returned to Nur-Sultan after hearing of her death. His sudden departure seemed to indicate a desire to avoid any consequences for his actions. Assel's family, friends, and the authorities were left to grapple with the shock of her untimely death, trying to understand how things had gone so terribly wrong. Before her death, Assel had reached out to a friend, asking for a loan of 100,000 Georgian lari, about $220, which she said she needed for travel expenses. She did not contact her family, possibly to avoid worrying them, but it was clear that her desire for independence had led her to take risks that ultimately proved fatal. The authorities and her loved ones were left to piece together the events leading up to her tragic death, unsure of how things had spiraled out of control so quickly. What started as an opportunity for a better life ended in heartbreak and tragedy. Assel's journey, filled with hope and dreams of a brighter future, had ended in a violent and untimely death, leaving a trail of unanswered questions and a deep sense of loss for everyone who had cared for her. Assel's situation had grown more desperate. Her friend, wanting to help, was unable to send the requested loan due to financial limitations. This detail later raised more troubling questions among those close to Assel. Initially, the Georgian police suspected that Assel had jumped from the window intentionally. However, her family strongly disagreed with this conclusion. They knew Assel as a vibrant and optimistic young woman, full of plans for her future. The opportunity in Georgia had promised a way to improve her financial situation, and she had dreamed of one day owning her own apartment. The idea that she would take her own life seemed impossible to them. Assel's mother was particularly distressed when she saw her daughter's body after it was returned to Kazakhstan. The injuries she noticed did not match those typically associated with a fall from a great height. The usual fractures in the arms and legs were absent, and her arms were strangely crossed over her chest, which was not consistent with the usual posture in such cases. There was no head trauma, which further raised suspicions. The internal injuries, including a ruptured spleen and damage to other organs, suggested Assel had suffered significant abuse before her death. Most unsettling were the signs of burns on her body, which appeared to be cigarette marks, and several of her teeth had been knocked out. The possibility that she had been tortured in her final hours was horrifying. Her mother could not fathom that Assel would have taken such extreme action herself. The grim details surrounding her death only deepened the family's suspicions that Assel had been subjected to abuse before her tragic end. Upon the return of her body, they became even more convinced that she had not jumped but had been placed under the windows of the high-rise building after her death to stage it as a suicide. However, the Georgian authorities refused to entertain any theory of foul play and closed the case without further investigation. Beso initially refused to cooperate with the investigation. However, when evidence emerged that suggested an intimate encounter between him and Assel shortly before her death, he admitted there had been physical contact, but he insisted it was consensual. His version of events started on April 30, 2021, when he learned that Murat Myrov, the man who had brought Assel to Georgia, had mistreated her severely. Beso claimed he was angered by this and decided to confront Myrov. He allegedly physically assaulted Myrov and threatened him to leave Georgia and stay away from Assel. Beso later claimed that after the confrontation, he offered Assel a place to stay at his home, promising her protection. According to his account, Assel stayed with him for several days, during which time he tried to care for her and help her cope with the trauma she had experienced. Beso insisted that their interactions were based on mutual trust and that any intimacy between them was consensual. On the night of her death, Beso said he left Assel alone in the living room while he took a shower. When he returned, he found the balcony door open, and upon looking outside, saw Assel's body on the ground below. Panic overtook him. Beso's criminal record made him fear being blamed for what had happened. He claimed that when he saw Assel's body, he was too afraid to climb over the fence to check on her. He said he stood there for a few moments, paralyzed with fear, before fleeing the scene. With his background, he feared being accused of causing her death, and so he left the city in haste to avoid facing any potential consequences. In July 2021, Beso died in a prison hospital. The official cause of death was listed as a heart attack, though Assel's case remained unresolved. The family and investigators were left to piece together the events surrounding her tragic death, struggling to understand how a hopeful opportunity in Georgia had turned into a nightmare that ultimately cost Assel her life. In late July 2022, new forensic evidence emerged that strengthened the case against Murat. DNA traces found on Assel's clothing confirmed his involvement. By then, the investigation, bolstered by journalistic efforts, was starting to paint a clearer picture of Assel's suffering in the days leading up to her death. The trial of Murat Myrov was one of the most publicized events in Kazakhstan. Despite overwhelming evidence against him, he denied all involvement in Assel's death, claiming he was the victim of false accusations. His lack of remorse infuriated those who had been following the case. The prosecutor argued that Murat had handed Assel over to Beso for his own gain, fully aware of Beso's violent past. On August 2, 2022, Murat Myrov was found guilty of human trafficking and acts of aggression. He was sentenced to 15 years in a maximum security prison and ordered to pay Assel's parents 5 million tenge as compensation for their emotional suffering. Although the verdict provided some sense of justice, Assel's family remained unconvinced that the full truth had been uncovered. They continued to believe that her death was not just the result of mistreatment but was part of a deliberate and calculated crime that needed further investigation.